the wrong categories, because every society, every civilization is evil in some ways and good in others. And you're also, if I may say so, you are projecting onto the past your own contemporary morality. If you think about racism, for a moment, most of human history has been dominated by people who have thought in racial terms, who have divided the world and the peoples that they govern according to their races. It is absolutely ubiquitous, it is absolutely normal. And we, of course, because we now live in anti-racist societies, we are simply projecting onto the past. They would not understand us, Mehdi. It would be completely ahistorical. So I ask the audience to think historically and not moralistically.
So the problem, Lawrence, is that Nigel specifically wrote a book saying he wanted to make a moral assessment of empire. So if you have a problem with the morality side of things, you should take it up with Nigel, not me. That was the goal of the book. In terms of what you said about projecting onto the past, I hear that argument a lot, and I take your point about racism and where society goes. But killing lots of people, I'm pretty sure they thought that was wrong in 1850, 1750, 1650. Murdering and massacring women and children, I think they thought that was wrong at the time as well.
But isn't it remarkable in the history of the British Empire that at a certain point in the 19th century, they began to think differently about the use of violence. And they wanted, for example...
Because they set up concentration camps in South Africa straight after.
Perhaps, but what they wanted to do was trade. Now, the British Empire, as you presented, is one long exercise in the same thing. But as a historian, I put it to you that it's not. A free trade empire in the 19th century is really about commercial interest.
So let me bring in Kojo Karam, who's a professor of law and history at the University of Loughborough, author of Uncommonwealth, Britain and the Aftermath of Empire. Nigel says many of the actions behind the people setting empire were admirable in some ways. People wanted to establish self-government, he said. You just had Lawrence say free trade empire. What is wrong with that view of the empire, in your opinion?
Well, I think what we need to do is actually look at what was said by some of the people who set up the empire. And what's fortunate about the British Empire is so much of the heavy lifting of the empire wasn't done by the British state, was actually done by a number of private chartered companies. And what you can see in their charters is their objective for why it's starting to extraction of wealth in those countries. And that is maximum their shareholders, do some cultural practices or play a little football with the natives as part of that project is not the objective of these institutions. We can look at the historical conversation that happened, not subsequently rewriting history, but at the time. Look at the words of, to say if I had said to you at the moment, the idea of colonization of the Caribbean was the great source of wealth and power in Britain, you might think that that's been written by a C.L.R. James, or an Eric Williams, or a Walter Rodney. No, that's Edmund Burke, the father of English conservatism. Until very recently, it was common sense that the British Empire gained most of its wealth from the colonization of the colonies, and it's in fact a lot of the revisionism that's being done right now.
Nigel, do you want to respond to Kojo or Govinda? He said
let me just start with Kojo, since it's the question in my mind. So Kojo, on that last point, you're quite right, and there are some economic historians who reckon that the contribution of slave trading and slavery to Britain's industrialization was, I think, everybody said enormous, others say central. Most economic historians that I know about say no, it was somewhere between small and modest. The greatest living historian of transatlantic slavery, David Eltis, and I say that because Henry Gates, the African-American historian at Harvard, rates Eltis as the most authoritative. He uses the word trivial in terms of contribution of slave trading and slavery. So one thing we need to be clear on that issue, anyone who makes an unqualified claim that slave trading and slavery made an enormous or central contribution to British industrial prosperity is not telling the whole truth.
After the break, you were doing this point about you treat one empire the same. The British Empire in many ways was worse than other empires.
Well, I don't empire to different forms. I don't accept the simple description of the British Empire as extractive, partly because the population of India during British rule increased by almost 3 times, which implies some level of increasing prosperity. The area of cultivatable land in India increased 8 times under the British. So I don't deny there were instances of exploitation and extraction, but to characterize the whole of the empire in those terms is simply wrong, because the empire gave indigenous peoples opportunities they'd never had.
Just to clarify, I mean, you mentioned the population. There was also studies done, Journal World Development did a study that between 1890 and 1920, there were 50 million excess deaths in India. We will continue this discussion. There's more to go. We've mentioned slavery a few times tonight. We will go back to our panel. We will hear more from Nigel in part 2 of Head to Head, when we come back with Nigel Biggar to talk about his other book, Reparations, Slavery, and the Tyranny of Imaginary Guilt. Don't go away. Welcome back to Head to Head on Al Jazeera. My guest tonight is Nigel Biggar, moral theologian, conservative peer, author of the book Reparations, Slavery, and the Tyranny of Imaginary Guilt. Nigel, first half we talked about colonialism, empire in your first book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. Let's talk about slavery, which you write about in your colonialism book. You also write about in your book this year, Reparations. You said slavery has come in a variety of forms throughout history. It's existed since time immemorial. You say, quote, "It is obvious that slavery is wrong." But then you go on to say in the same paragraph that there could be good and bad forms of it. Can you tell the audience here what a good form of slavery is?
Well, for example, domestic slavery in the Islamic world was a lot less inhumane than chattel slavery on the sugar plantations of the West Indies, as I'm sure you'd agree. And in the Islamic world, some slaves could rise to very high positions of political power. So even though I think all slavery in which human beings are the property of someone else and have no rights whatsoever is wrong for that reason, nevertheless that can take different forms, some of which are a lot less inhumane.
So what you meant to say is there are less worse forms. There are no good forms of slavery. Because you were good, and that jumped out to me as a moral philosopher. You would say there's something as a good slavery.
No, I mean, I make perfectly clear I think slavery as such is wrong for the reason I've said. So yes, less worse.
By the way, I noticed you mentioned in the book, and you just said a moment ago, Islamic slavery. And yet, throughout the book, both books, I never see you refer to what the British or the Portuguese did as Christian slavery. Why?
So the use of the word Islamic there is not referring to religion as such, it's referring to a culture. I could have said Arab, but I'm not quite clear whether there were Muslim peoples who were involved in slavery who weren't Arab. So I use that either term.
But you would be happy to use the phrase Christian slavery?
Yes, I would.
Okay.
Oh, yes, I would.
You've argued in your book, Reparations, Slavery, and the Tyranny of Imaginary Guilt, that Britain has already essentially paid penance for slavery by abolishing it and later fighting against the slave trade. Putting aside the arguments around practicality and logistics, how you would do reparations, we park that for a moment. As an ethicist, do you believe there is a moral case still for Britain to offer some form of reparations for its big role in slavery?
No.
Why?
Several reasons. First of all, as I said, slavery was a universal institution. Secondly, lots of people were involved in the transatlantic slave trade, not least Africans. So if we're going to have, as it were, an accounting of who owes what, then African nations need to take into account as well. Third, the British were among the first peoples in the history of the world to abolish both the trade and the treaty, and then spent both money and lives suppressing it worldwide. Does that make up for what was done to the millions of African slaves in the West Indies or southern American colonies? No, it doesn't. There's no way we can. I mean, those people are dead. The best the British could do was to stop it, and then to try and stop other people engaging in it.
I just want to unpack this in a couple of points there. In terms of African countries, we talked about this in part 1. That is what about it. From a moral point of view, whether Britain should offer some form of reparations or apology for slavery is irrelevant what other people do. You're responsible for your own actions, not why.
By all means, Britain should acknowledge responsibility for that. So should African countries, and they don't. So it's a matter of fairness.
That's not true.
It's a matter of fairness. The African Union.
Benin.
The African Union.
Hold on. You said African countries have not.
actually
It's comprising lots of...
Well, we're not in the European Union, as people know anymore, so let's forget about unions.
African Union,
Well, we're not in the EU.
years ago, had said
Okay.
that it plans to submit a bill to Britain for reparations for slavery.
Great.
When lots of African countries,
Okay.
especially West Africa, were involved.
You're not dealing with the central point, which is you said African countries are not apologized, are not involved in some form of reparation. Uganda and Benin have both apologized. Why can't we follow them and do the same?
Apologize, okay.
It's a formal state apology. Why can't the British government do it?
Because we apologized
The Dutch have done it.
ago by stopping it and suppressing
That's
it.
not an apology.
It's what more than an apology.
Nigel, you are a professor. You are a professor of moral theology. And when I hear you speak, if I went out, if me and all my neighbors killed everyone in the local area, hold on, let me finish my analogy. Let's pretend that I'm your student in class. I'm making my pitch for you, Professor. If me and all my friends killed everyone in the local area, we constantly killed and kidnapped people in the local area, and then I stopped doing it, and I then made all my neighbors stop doing it, you're telling me that that's any kind of justice for the people I killed or kidnapped? That they've had any kind of accountability? That I've made up for what I did, just by stopping doing it? Stopping committing a crime, you don't get a prize for stopping committing a crime.